I'm offering you $1 million. Do you happen to have a 7-cent nail? They thought I was just another dusty cowboy. They didn't know what I was fighting for.
Promise me you'll take care of our little girl.
The day they offered Eleanor Whitmore $1 million to save her late father's ranch, most people believed they were witnessing the end of a legacy. Only 3 weeks had passed since the funeral of William Whitmore, one of the most respected ranchers in Texas. For decades, he had built the Whitmore Ranch into a symbol of strength, hard work, and tradition. But now he was gone, and his only daughter, Eleanor Whitmore, stood alone at the center of a crisis she never expected to face. At 38 years old, Eleanor had inherited thousands of acres of land, hundreds of employees, and responsibilities she was still learning to manage. Unfortunately, tragedy had chosen the worst possible moment to strike again. The ranch's historic irrigation system suddenly failed. The massive water pump that supplied much of the property stopped working without warning. Fields began drying out. Livestock owners grew nervous. Workers scrambled for answers. Engineers, mechanics, and technicians spent days trying to repair the machine. Nothing worked. The situation became so serious that a wealthy investor named Victor Kane arrived with what seemed like a solution. Standing in front of ranch workers, local officials, and curious townspeople, he made an extraordinary offer. $1 million, he announced, if anyone can get that machine running before sunset. The crowd fell silent. Everyone knew it was impossible. The equipment was decades old. Replacement parts no longer existed. Even the experts had given up. Then a dusty cowboy standing near the back of the crowd stepped forward. Nobody knew his name. Nobody paid much attention to him. He removed his hat, studied the machine for a few moments, and calmly asked a question that made several people laugh. "Do you happen to have a 7-cent nail?" The crowd stared at him. The engineers exchanged amused looks. Victor Kane smirked, and Eleanor looked completely confused. But as I stood there staring at that broken machine, I had a feeling the problem wasn't nearly as complicated as everyone believed. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my life I've been a cowboy. Not the kind people write songs about. Not the kind you see in magazines posing beside expensive horses. I'm the kind who wakes up before sunrise, repairs broken fences with his own hands, hauls hay in an old pickup truck that rattles every time it hits a pothole, and spends every day trying to keep a small ranch alive, despite bills that seem determined to multiply. My ranch sits about 15 miles outside town. It's not much. A weathered barn, a modest house, a few horses, a handful of cattle, and more debt than I'd care to admit. Most of my equipment is older than I am. My tractor leaks oil. The roof of my barn needs repairs. Every month feels like a balancing act between paying expenses and hoping nothing expensive breaks. But it's home. And more importantly, it's where I'm raising my daughter. Emma is 8 years old. She loves horses more than anything in the world. If she's not feeding them, brushing them, or talking to them, she's reading about them. Sometimes I think she understands horses better than she understands people. The horses certainly seem to listen to her. She inherited that gift from her mother, Sarah, my wife, the woman who should still be here. 6 years ago, cancer took her from us. Even now, there are moments when I hear Emma laugh, and it feels like Sarah never left. The night before Sarah passed away, I sat beside her hospital bed while Emma slept nearby, holding her favorite stuffed horse. Sarah reached for my hand. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. "Promise me something, Jacob." I told her anything. "Take care of our little girl," I promised. Then she smiled. "Make sure she always knows she's loved." I promised that too. Those promises became the center of my life. Every early morning, every late night, every sacrifice, every decision, everything I do is for Emma. That's why I keep fighting for a ranch that most people would have sold years ago. That's why I keep repairing equipment instead of replacing it. That's why I keep going, even when things get difficult. Because giving up was never an option. The funny thing is that none of those people standing around the broken irrigation machine knew any of that. To them I was just another dusty cowboy, another rancher trying to make a living. What they also didn't know was that I wasn't a complete stranger to the Whitmore family. Years before, William Whitmore became one of the most respected ranch owners in Texas. I had worked for him, only for a short time. Just a young ranch hand trying to earn money. But those months changed my life. William wasn't an easy man to work for. He demanded discipline, hard work, attention to detail, but he was fair. And unlike many wealthy ranch owners, he treated every worker with respect. One afternoon, after I had made a costly mistake repairing a piece of equipment, I expected to be fired. Instead, William spent an hour teaching me something I never forgot. "Most people look at the big parts," he told me. "The smartest men look at the small ones." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Years later, standing in front of that broken irrigation machine, those words came rushing back, because while everyone else was focused on complicated solutions, expensive repairs, and impossible odds, I had a feeling William Whitmore had already left behind the answer, and if I was right, saving his daughter's ranch might require something far simpler than anyone imagined. William Whitmore was the kind of man people still talked about years after he was gone. Around Texas, that isn't something that happens often. Most ranchers are remembered by their families. A few are remembered by their neighbors. But legends are remembered by entire communities. William was one of those men. Long before the Whitmore Ranch became one of the largest properties in the state, it was nothing more than a few acres of dry land, a small wooden barn, and a stubborn young rancher who refused to quit. People said he built everything from the ground up, fence by fence, horse by horse, field by field. Every acre carried his fingerprints. Every building carried part of his story. By the time he passed away, his ranch employed hundreds of people and supported families across the county. Yet despite his success, William never fully trusted modern shortcuts. That was one of the reasons the old irrigation system still existed. Most ranch owners had replaced similar equipment decades earlier. Not William. He believed that if something was built properly, it could last forever if you understood how it worked. The problem was that very few people actually understood how it worked, especially after his death. Standing beside the silent machine, I watched engineers study diagrams. Mechanics argued over worn components. Technicians discussed electrical systems. Everyone was searching for complicated answers, everyone except me. Because years earlier, before I owned my own ranch, I had spent several months working for William Whitmore. Back then, I was barely 20 years old, just another ranch hand trying to earn enough money to survive. Most wealthy ranch owners barely noticed workers like me. William was different. He paid attention. He believed every employee should understand not only what they were doing, but why they were doing it. Whenever equipment broke down, he'd often gather younger workers around him and explain how the machinery functioned, not because he had to, because he enjoyed teaching. One summer afternoon, I remember helping him repair part of the irrigation system. The machine was already old back then, older than me. I asked him why he didn't replace it. He laughed. Because everybody thinks the machine is complicated. Then he tapped the metal housing with his wrench. The truth is, most machines fail because of one tiny part. At the time, I thought he was just sharing another lesson. Years later, I realized he was giving me a blueprint for solving problems. William had an unusual way of thinking. Whenever something stopped working, he never started with the biggest component. He started with the smallest, the overlooked parts, the forgotten pieces, the details nobody else considered important. As I stared at the irrigation system now, those memories returned. The machine itself wasn't beautiful. Decades of repairs had left scars everywhere. The metal was worn. The paint was faded. The pipes rattled whenever pressure moved through them. But William had always claimed that appearances didn't matter. Understanding mattered. That was why something felt wrong about the crowd surrounding it. The engineers kept focusing on major assemblies. The mechanics kept discussing expensive replacements. The investor, Victor Kane, kept talking about how impossible the repair would be. Yet nobody seemed interested in asking the simplest question. What exactly caused the machine to stop? Not the symptoms, the cause. Those are very different things. I slowly walked around the equipment, studying every angle, every connection, every moving part. Then I noticed something. Not a broken gear, not a damaged motor, not a failed pipe. Something much smaller, something almost invisible, a detail hidden where nobody else had bothered to look. And in that moment, I realized everyone was searching in the wrong place. The machine wasn't failing because of a major breakdown. It was failing because of something so small that most people would never even think to inspect it. And if I was right, fixing it wouldn't cost thousands of dollars. It wouldn't require engineers. It wouldn't require replacement equipment. It would require something much simpler, something that cost only 7 cents. The moment I found the problem, I understood why nobody else had solved it. Not because the experts weren't smart, not because the engineers lacked experience, but because they were all looking at the wrong things. The entire crowd had become obsessed with complexity. They were studying massive gears, inspecting pipes, testing motors, reviewing blueprints. Meanwhile, the real problem was hiding in plain sight. I crouched beside the irrigation machine and brushed years of dust and grease away from a narrow metal housing near the main drive assembly. At first glance, it looked insignificant, a small forgotten section buried beneath larger components. But the moment I looked closer, I saw it. A worn-out nail, not a bolt, not a custom part, not a specialized component, a simple steel nail, tiny, old, almost invisible. For decades, it had secured a small alignment bracket that kept part of the machine operating correctly. Over time, weather, vibration, and constant use had worn it down. The nail had slowly bent, allowing the bracket to shift just enough to throw the entire system out of alignment. One tiny piece, one tiny failure, one giant consequence. I stood up. The crowd immediately looked at me. Eleanor stepped forward. "What is it?" I held up the nail. Several people frowned. One engineer actually laughed. "That's your diagnosis?" Another crossed his arms. "There's no way that's causing all of this." Victor Kane smirked from across the crowd. The wealthy investor seemed amused. "You're telling me this entire machine stopped because of a nail?" A few people laughed. Others shook their heads. The engineers began explaining why the problem had to be more complicated. The mechanics started listing expensive repairs again. The investors exchanged amused looks. I listened for a few moments, then shrugged. "Maybe you're right." That confused them. Then I continued. "There's only one way to find out." I reached into my toolbox. Inside was a replacement nail. Nothing special, nothing rare. Just a simple steel nail worth 7 cents. The crowd watched closely. Some out of curiosity, others because they expected me to fail. I carefully removed the damaged nail. The old metal practically crumbled in my hand. Then I installed the new one. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. No special tools, no expensive parts, no engineering degree, just patience. When I finished, I stepped away from the machine. The crowd fell silent. Eleanor looked nervous. The engineers looked skeptical. Victor looked entertained. I reached for the ignition lever. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The wind, the conversations, even the birds. Then I pulled the lever. Nothing happened. Several people smiled. One investor quietly laughed. Then suddenly, a deep metallic rumble echoed through the ranch. The machine shuddered. A gear turned, then another. Moments later, the massive irrigation system roared back to life. Water surged through the pipes. Pressure gauges climbed. Valves opened. The entire machine began operating exactly as it had before. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Absolute silence. Then came the shock. The engineers stared at the machine. The mechanics exchanged confused looks. Workers began cheering. People who had doubted me only moments earlier couldn't believe what they were seeing. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand. Tears appeared in her eyes, not because of the machine, because the ranch had been saved. Fields would survive. Livestock would survive. Her father's legacy would survive. And all because of a 7-cent nail. The crowd erupted into applause. But while everyone else celebrated, I noticed something strange. One person wasn't happy, not even a little. Victor Kane, the man who had offered $1 million, the man who claimed he wanted to help. Instead of smiling, he looked furious. His jaw tightened. His eyes locked onto the machine, then onto me. And in that moment I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. Victor wasn't disappointed that he lost a bet. He was angry because the machine was working, as if he had expected it to stay broken, as if saving the ranch had ruined a plan only he knew about. And suddenly, the 7-cent nail didn't seem like the most important discovery of the day. Most people were still celebrating when I started asking questions. The irrigation system was running again. Water was flowing through the fields. Workers were cheering. Eleanor looked like a woman who had just been given a second chance. And yet something didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the less sense the situation made. Machines wear down naturally. Parts fail. That's normal. But this felt different. The 7-cent nail I had replaced wasn't simply old. It had been tampered with. The wear pattern was wrong. The damage wasn't consistent with decades of use. Someone had deliberately weakened it. The realization bothered me enough that I couldn't let it go. That evening, after the crowd dispersed, I returned to the machine, alone. The sun had already disappeared beyond the horizon. The ranch was quiet. Most people had gone home. I brought a flashlight and began inspecting the system again. Every bracket, every bolt, every connection. Years of ranch work had taught me how equipment fails. My time as a Texas Ranger had taught me how people hide things. And what I found that night looked a lot more like the second than the first. Near the rear housing of the machine, hidden behind an access panel covered in dust, I discovered a small metal box. At first, I assumed it contained spare parts. Instead, it contained documents. Old documents, very old documents. The papers were wrapped in oilcloth and protected from moisture. Someone had hidden them there intentionally. When I opened the bundle, I immediately recognized the signature on the first page. William Whitmore, Eleanor's father. I sat down right there beside the machine and began reading. The documents weren't business records. They were personal notes, maintenance journals, handwritten observations, detailed instructions about how the irrigation system worked. William had apparently spent years documenting every repair, every modification, and every weakness in the system, but buried among those notes was something far more important. A warning, a very specific warning. One page had been underlined several times. Across the top, William had written, "If anything happens to me, watch the management team carefully." A chill ran down my spine. I continued reading. The entries became more troubling. William described disagreements with senior administrators, missing funds, questionable contracts, pressure from investors, people trying to convince him to sell portions of the ranch. The notes grew more detailed as time went on. Names appeared, dates, meetings, financial concerns. By midnight, one pattern had become impossible to ignore. William didn't fear competitors. He feared someone inside his own operation, someone he believed was slowly positioning himself to take control of the ranch. The final pages were the most disturbing. William wrote that if the irrigation system ever failed unexpectedly, it should be investigated immediately, not repaired. Investigated. According to him, certain individuals had access to maintenance records and could easily create failures that looked accidental. I stared at the pages for several minutes, because suddenly everything made sense. The damaged nail, the timing, the pressure on Eleanor, the $1 million offer. None of it was random. Someone had wanted the ranch in crisis. Someone had wanted Eleanor desperate. The next morning, I showed the documents to Eleanor. The color drained from her face as she read her father's words. She recognized the handwriting immediately. She recognized the names, too. Several had long since left the ranch. One had not. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the notes. A man William trusted at first. A man who slowly gained influence over ranch operations. A man who constantly pushed for outside investors and ownership changes. A man who happened to be standing beside Eleanor the day the irrigation system failed. Victor Kane, the wealthy investor who offered $1 million. The man who acted disappointed when the machine started working. The man who would have benefited the most if the ranch collapsed. Neither Eleanor nor I spoke for several seconds. We simply stared at the final page. Because the more we uncovered, the clearer the truth became. The irrigation system hadn't been the target. The ranch had. And for the first time, we had a suspect, a very powerful suspect. The moment Eleanor finished reading her father's hidden notes, everything changed. Until then, we had suspicions, questions, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. But now we had something far more dangerous. A direction, a name. Victor Kane, the wealthy investor who claimed he wanted to save the Whitmore Ranch. The man who offered $1 million when the irrigation system failed. The man who seemed strangely disappointed when the machine started working again. At first, Eleanor didn't want to believe it. Honestly, neither did I. Victor had been part of the ranch's business operations for years. He attended meetings with her father. He helped negotiate contracts. He was trusted by bankers, investors, and local officials. On the surface, he looked like an ally. But experience had taught me something during my years as a Texas Ranger. The most dangerous people rarely look dangerous. They look trustworthy, respectable, helpful. That's what allows them to get close enough to cause damage. Over the following weeks, I began investigating quietly. I reviewed maintenance records, financial statements, contract approvals, vendor agreements, employee reports. The deeper I dug, the worse things became. The irrigation failure wasn't an isolated incident. Neither was the damaged equipment, nor the missing funds William had mentioned in his notes. Every trail eventually led back to Victor. Certain contractors were receiving unusually large payments. Maintenance budgets were being redirected. Repair schedules were being altered. Critical inspections had been delayed. Employees who questioned unusual decisions were suddenly reassigned or pressured into silence. It was all subtle, carefully planned, just enough to weaken the ranch without attracting attention. Then I discovered the real objective. Victor didn't want to help the Whitmore ranch. He wanted to own it. The plan was almost brilliant. Allow the ranch to slowly struggle after William's death. Create expensive problems, reduce profits, increase pressure on Eleanor, make her doubt herself. Eventually force her into accepting outside investment or selling portions of the property. And standing there, ready to buy it all at a discount, would be Victor Kane. The irrigation system was supposed to be the final blow. Without water, the ranch would lose enormous amounts of money. Panic would spread. Investors would gain leverage. Victor would become the hero who arrived with solutions. The only problem? A 7-cent nail ruined everything. Once we had enough evidence, Eleanor made a decision. The truth would be revealed publicly, not behind closed doors, not through lawyers, publicly, at the annual County Ranchers' Assembly, the biggest gathering of ranch owners in the region. The entire town showed up. Farmers, business owners, bankers, reporters, employees. Even people with no connection to the ranch wanted to see what was happening. Victor arrived looking confident, relaxed, smiling. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The meeting began normally. Then Eleanor walked onto the stage. The room fell silent. One by one, she presented the documents. The hidden records left by her father, the manipulated contracts, the suspicious payments, the maintenance reports, the altered invoices. Then she called me forward. I stepped onto the stage carrying a thick folder. For the next 30 minutes, I explained everything. How the sabotage occurred, how employees had been manipulated, how critical information had been hidden, how money had quietly disappeared, and how every road led to the same destination. Victor Kane. The room erupted. People began whispering, then arguing, then demanding answers. Victor finally stood. For a moment it looked like he might defend himself. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documents, the signatures, the transactions, the testimony. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. The respected investor who wanted everyone to believe he was saving the ranch had actually been trying to destroy it. The entire town witnessed it. The reporters recorded every second. The ranchers who once admired him stared in disbelief. And just like that, years of deception collapsed in a single afternoon. As deputies escorted Victor from the building, the crowd broke into applause. Not for me, not for Eleanor, for the truth. William Whitmore's legacy had survived, his ranch had survived, and the man who tried to steal it had finally been exposed. But standing there beside Eleanor, watching the crowd celebrate, I realized something. The real hero wasn't me. It wasn't even the 7-cent nail. It was William. Because even after his death, he had left behind exactly what his daughter needed. The truth. A week after Victor Kane was exposed, life at the Whitmore Ranch finally began to feel normal again. The investigations continued. Lawyers were still sorting through contracts. Auditors were reviewing years of financial records. But for the first time since William Whitmore's death, the future no longer felt uncertain. The ranch was safe. The employees knew their jobs were secure. The irrigation system was running perfectly, and most importantly, Eleanor could finally breathe again. One evening, just before sunset, I received a call asking if I could stop by the ranch. When I arrived, I found Eleanor standing near the same irrigation machine that had nearly changed everything. The machine hummed quietly in the background. Water flowed through the fields. The setting sun painted the sky with shades of orange and gold. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply looked across the ranch, at the cattle grazing in the distance, at the workers finishing their day, at the land William Whitmore had spent his life building. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. I almost lost everything. Her voice was soft, honest, not the voice of a powerful ranch owner, the voice of a daughter. I nodded, because she was right. A few more weeks, a few more failures, a few more lies, and the outcome could have been very different. She looked down at the ground, then back at me. Why did you help me? The question caught me by surprise. Not because I didn't know the answer, because the answer was so simple. I smiled. Because your father once helped me when nobody else would. She looked confused, so I told her the story. Years ago, when I was young, broke, and trying to figure out my place in the world, I made a costly mistake while working at the Whitmore Ranch. The kind of mistake that should have gotten me fired. Most ranch owners would have shown me the gate. William didn't. Instead, he spent an entire afternoon teaching me how to fix what I'd broken. More importantly, he taught me how to think, how to pay attention, how to solve problems, how to look beyond the obvious. That lesson stayed with me for the rest of my life, including the day I found a 7-cent nail hidden inside an irrigation machine. By the time I finished the story, Eleanor's eyes were filled with tears. Not sad tears, grateful ones. For a moment she simply nodded, as if she finally understood why her father had been respected by so many people, because even years later, his kindness was still changing lives. Later that evening I drove home. As I pulled into my ranch, I immediately spotted Emma near the horse paddock. She was feeding carrots to a group of horses while talking non-stop about her day. Some things never change. A few minutes later, Eleanor arrived with some paperwork that needed her signature. But instead of going straight to business, she stopped beside the fence. Together we watched Emma. The little girl laughed as the horses nudged her pockets, searching for treats. The setting sun stretched across the fields behind her. For the first time in a long time, there were no emergencies, no sabotage, no investigations, no million-dollar offers, just peace. The kind of peace people spend years searching for. As the last light disappeared behind the horizon, I found myself thinking back to the day everything started. A broken machine, a desperate ranch, a wealthy investor, and a 7-cent nail. People offered $1 million to save a ranch. In the end, it only took a 7-cent nail, and someone willing to pay attention. If you had been there that day, would you have trusted the millionaire? Or the cowboy asking for a 7-cent nail? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, courage, ranches, and cowboys who never give up, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.